So we've got Bryan Smith from the Ministry of the Environment. He's talking about freshwater farm plans now and the future. So Bryan's Chief Advisor for Freshwater at the Ministry for the Environment. He's played a major role in the development and now implementation of the government's essential freshwater package of reforms. I have to say, in the early stages, I remember you presenting at a forum in Wellington with probably a bigger crowd than this, and you were taking some pretty hard-hitting questions. You did bloody well, I have to say, so well done. So prior to this role, Bryan has held a variety of senior policy roles across the public service, including leading the interagency group on family violence, leading the implementation of adventure activities regulation, development of the emission trading scheme, and dairy industry restructuring. I have to say, as part of that career, we worked together at the Ministry of Forestry as well, but that's going back a while now. Yeah. Bryan's also co-chaired the land use change and forestry negotiations under the UN Climate Change Convention. He's a graduate of the Canterbury School of Forestry, so welcome, Bryan.
Thanks very much. Is this working, or shall I stand here? Either works.
Either.
Or I can use that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Do you want a roving mic or?
I'll use a roving mic. It's better than standing behind a podium for me, from my perspective. All right, so I'm going to talk about freshwater farm plans, and I know this is the last talk before lunch, and you guys will probably want to go and get something to eat, and that's fair enough. I've got about, 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll do some questions if you've got questions from the floor as well, if that works for you guys. Before I do freshwater farm plans, I just wanted to sort of centre that in the essential freshwater reforms, which I've been involved with since very late 2017 and was brought on to do that job specifically. Of course, that was a priority for Minister Parker, who you heard from this morning, and that first term of government we worked pretty hard, and as Dougal said, we got some interesting feedback throughout the way. These are really hard issues and they've been around for a long time. We haven't resolved all of them either, which we can touch on as well. But this package came together in late 2020, September 2020. The National Policy Statement Freshwater, you've heard Ian talk about that this morning. You know, probably that's where Te Mana o Te Wai sits as the new korowai that sits across planning and all aspects of freshwater management. That's the direction from central government to regional councils, predominantly regional councils. There's a few bits and pieces in there that deal with district councils as well, but predominantly regional councils about the process and the expectations and the minimum bottom lines for freshwater management and meeting minimum bottom lines between now and the indefinite future, but the initial step will be this first generation of new land and water plans by December 2024. That was only part of the package. The other parts of the package were the National Environmental Standard on Freshwater. That's where you'll find protections for wetlands, so the new rules around protecting the quality and extent of wetlands is in there. That's where you'll find rules around intensive winter grazing. That's where you'll find rules around nitrogen cap, for example. So they bite immediately. Though it's fair to say, there's quite a job in getting those new rules out. And of course some of them phase in over time. There's the stock exclusion regulations. They again phase in over time, requiring stock exclusion from all low slope land for cattle, deer and pigs. All right, and for all dairy cattle in all places. So again, it's one of those measures that the government put in place, some long-term sort of strategic direction to regional councils and some short-term binding initiatives to make improvement as quickly as we could, both through stock exclusion and the National Environmental Standard. It's all supported by a new freshwater planning process, which we changed the RMA. That planning process will be brought over into the new RM reform system in a slightly different form, because we'll use a different basis of commissioners, but the same idea will follow through, which is independent commissioners taking over the review stage at the hearing stage of planning, of developing a new regional plan. Sitting under all of that is this new system that I'm going to talk today, which is the freshwater farm plan system. So I won't touch on that anymore now. And then underneath all of that was around about 700 million out of the Jobs for Nature initiative that came out of COVID, targeted towards water policy, We've got some of that left. In fact, we've got, a significant chunk of change left. Something like $100 million is left being allocated into buckets but not yet spent. And the government ministers agreed that we should focus that on trying to support the implementation of some of these reforms. So initially it was focused on getting fence posts and plants in the ground and employment and those sorts of very tactical things that we wanted to do, thinking about unemployment and the response to COVID. Subsequently, it's more focused on more strategic issues, building capacity, capability. So there is money and resource there available. It's not massive when you spread it from one end of the country to the other, and we need to do it, spend it really cleverly and invest it really, really wisely. But nonetheless, there is still some resource there, which I can touch on a little bit in a second as well. Apologies if you've heard this talk before. You never quite know where everybody's at in the room, so I like to always start with a sort of foundation of where freshwater farm plans fit in a wider system reform. So why did we do freshwater farm planning? Well, there's a bunch of reasons really. One of them, and probably the most critical, is it's a new tool in the resource management toolbox, right? And it's important to think of it that way. It sits somewhere between resource consents, and all of the complexities and the challenges of resource consenting, and they're quite rigid things, and they tend to be for many years, and then permitted activity status and rules and a plan at the other sort of extreme, neither of which really seem to fit terribly well with some of the challenges we have with diffuse emissions and the complexity of the New Zealand farming environment. And we found this ourselves, you're probably well aware that we had a go at a few nationally set regulations for things like stock exclusion, intensive winter grazing, wetland protection. And we found that we actually had to relook at those once we put them out there, because actually it's really hard to write national regulation that is sensible across every situation in New Zealand. Hence, freshwater farm plans are designed so that at the farm scale, you can start working out what's sensible and appropriate at that farm scale, in that catchment, in that context. They were happening anyway, so you'll be aware that there are a number of regional councils that got farm plans. We were a bit worried that we were going to have 16 different farm plan systems, and that, for example, people operating in one wouldn't be able to operate somewhere else, and the rules would be different from one place to the other. So this brought it together as a national kind of a national system, which should allow maximum interoperability between regions, for example. Third, it brings together, and this is really important as well, it brings together in one place all the stuff that farmers need to know about and do, right? From the region, whatever the regional council has put in place, to whatever national requirements might be, to whatever good management practice might sort of require or suggest they should do. And it brings all that together in one place for a farmer. And I guess you guys are all professionals, you know how difficult it is to get your head around everything that's going on, not just at the moment, but what's been going on in the past. And because the Freshwater Farm Plan brings this together through a certifier, a professional certifier, we think it'll really help farmers to understand what their obligations are, commitments are, and to plan for their situation. We know that they can make a huge difference, and I'll touch on that a little bit in just a second, but we know they can be really, really effective in terms of environmental outcomes, and they can link to industry programs as well. So there are a number of industry groups we're already working with, the wine industry, for example, where they could take their existing programs and they can adapt them so that they can deliver a Freshwater Farm Plan compliant system. And that, of course, allows them to link in with, a community assurance expectation or customer assurance expectations as well. I want to just touch on sediment. You're probably all well aware, sediment is one of those legacy kind of contaminants, pollutants in this country that, has been a major, major problem for us. We've still got something like 1.5 million hectares, might be as much as 2 million, depending on who you ask, of highly erodible land that is currently not in the conservation estate and doesn't have tree cover, i.e., it's being used for pastoral agriculture in particular. Now, that is an enormous challenge for us as a country, and what we know is that our current approaches to dealing with sediment could take more than 100 years at our current rate of investment in order to materially address our sediment challenges. Freshwater farm plans, we know, both from the practical experience in places like, the SLUI program that Horizons has been operating, and from the modelling that's been done by our Land and Water, and modelling that we had done when we did our regulatory impact statement, we know that freshwater farm planning and farm interventions at a catchment scale can make a really significant difference and improvement to sediment loads. So I think that freshwater farm plans will be one of the great sort of turning points in the legacy history of New Zealand and sediment. It's not quite the same story with nutrients though, or some nutrients anyway. With nitrogen, there's some particular challenges with nitrates. So in some catchments, and we're starting to, the regional councils are starting to put this framework together as well. In some catchments we've got, we're in pretty good shape actually in terms of nutrients. Freshwater farm planning in those catchments are likely to make material, landscape, but probably quite modest improvements to overall nutrient loads. And that should create headroom for further development. Should create improvements in water quality as well. In some catchments, we've got catchments that are over-allocated, but not massively over-allocated. Freshwater farm planning may well make quite a significant contribution in those catchments as well. Where you've got 10%, 20%, 30% reductions in nutrient or nitrogen discharges required in order to meet sort of environmental bottom lines. Where we've got really over-allocated catchments though, where you might need an 80% or 90% reduction in nutrient loads, freshwater farm plans will not be enough to generate that kind of reduction. We understand that, we know that. And in those circumstances, the most important thing will be what the regional council does and the transition plan it lays out, the regional council lays out for reducing nutrients. And the reason I say that is because whatever the council sets out as its rules for nutrient management, the freshwater farm plan has to reflect those rules in the plan. So if, for example, the council said, we've got to make a 60% reduction in nutrient loads in order to reach our bottom lines. We're going to do that over 20 years, for example. In the first 10 years, this plan, we need to get a 30% reduction in nutrient load, for example. And the various types of farming systems need to make a certain level of reduction. They could put that in their regional plan, right? What has to happen then is the farm plan needs to reflect how the farmer is going to achieve that, because the farm plan has to be consistent with the regional plan rules. We've seen situations where kind of farm planning has been relied on maybe too much in order to deliver reductions, and actually there has to be kind of harder rules in place in some places. So this is the process. The big difference, I guess, between freshwater farm plans and a lot of planning that's done at the moment, a lot of environmental planning that's done at the moment, is the importance of catchment context and risk assessment being done before you start looking at the actions you're going to take. So what we're expecting is that regional councils, predominantly regional councils, will provide information about what's going on in each of those catchments where you need to have a freshwater farm plan. It might be that nutrients are the big problem. It might be that sediment is a big problem. It might be that in part of a subcatchment you've got a recreational zone, a swimming zone, that's heavily contaminated with E. coli or bacterially contaminated, for example. There might be culturally important sites, for example. So that information becomes critical to both the risk assessment that you do on farm and then identifying which actions you want to do. There's no point if you've got a big sediment problem and not a particularly bad nutrient problem in focusing your first attention on nutrients when actually it might be sediment that you need to focus your attention on. And we understand money is short. Farmers don't have bottomless pits and they don't have endless, management focus time in order to do everything. They can't do everything. So this is part of the prioritisation step. There's some inherent risks. Is the land erodible? Is it flat? Is it steep? Is it on the edge of a particularly critical estuarine environment, for example? And then there are management risks. What am I doing with the land? How intensely am I farming it? How much fertiliser am I putting on? Do I have cattle or do I have sheep? You know, all those sort of system risks. Those things come together to develop a risk assessment on farm, which you then have a look at farmers will look at what they're doing. What am I already doing about some of those risks, and where are the gaps? And from the gaps, what are my actions that I'm going to put in place in order to address those? Now, the actions that you put in place, there's a hierarchy of actions to put in place. The first thing is any regulatory rules that are stricter than what you might otherwise have done. So if the regional plan says you have to do X, Y, or Z, the farm plan has to reflect X, Y, or Z. It's possible, actually, for the farm plan to be stricter than the regional rules. It's possible for the farm plan to be stricter than a resource consent requirement or condition on a resource consent. You might have a resource consent that said, you know, I can discharge effluent out to a stream. And it's conceivable that when you look at the guidance and the certifier looks at the risk profile and what's going on in that catchment, you might actually come up with a 5-year plan to change that, even though the resource consent might say you don't have to. So it's possible to go stricter than what's in a regional rule or in even in a resource consent. Then you come up with a 5-year action plan. I've spoken about that, identifying adverse effects. And I think I've spoken about identifying appropriate actions and coming up with a multiple year plan. The actions have to be time bound, they have to be measurable so that they can be enforceable, because farmers will be held to account for them, right? The certifier's job is a really critical job. So first, certifiers will be able to work with farmers directly if they want. We did have a number of comments that maybe we should separate that process, and you should have an advisor working with farmers to come up with a risk assessment and a plan, and then somebody comes in and certifies it separately. We kind of thought about that, but we thought it's probably better, and we think it's better, 3 minutes, I've got the 3-minute signal. It's better to have a system where one person can work with the farmer, provided you've got good quality assurance over that process. Right. So we do have money in our budget to do, for example, central government quality assurance processes, checking on the process, checking on the quality of the certification process, so that we've got independent verification of some of that stuff. The certifier needs to determine that the plan reflects catchment context, and that the actions are time-bound and measurable and reasonable. Right. There needs to be guidance developed around these things, but these actions have to be reasonable. The audit process, it's going to start with 12 months and then it'll become risk-based. So it might be up to 3 years depending on how well the farmer is demonstrating the compliance with the plan and implementing the actions of their plan. The auditor does not check the quality of the plan though. That's up to the certifier to do. The auditor checks that the plan is being implemented. We are going to have a dispute resolution mechanism, right? And the government has put in some money. I talked before about Jobs for Nature and trying to be a bit strategic about that. We're going to subsidise the cost of some of that dispute resolution first off for the first few years. The reason for that is this will take some time to bed in, and we don't want an individual farmer to, kind of get a rogue result, and for that individual farmer to have to pay all the costs of going through a process, to evaluate whether or not that was a fair result. So we will put in some subsidy money and significantly subsidise the cost of some of that review for the first few years. Certifiers and auditors are not enforcement agents. This has come up a lot. It's up to the regional councils to do the enforcement process. They will report some things. I've now got the 1-minute note. They will report if a farmer fails an audit, or if a farmer doesn't have a plan, and they should have a plan if they know about that, but they are not expected to be enforcement agents. There are lots of planning instruments out there at the moment, And those planning instruments, none of them align with all of the requirements of a freshwater farm plan system. Some are quite close, some are quite a long way away. Often it's about not having the right risk assessment process, it's not having a right auditable set of actions, for example. But as I said before, there are industry groups out there who are really keen to pick up this mantle and run with it, with their own systems, adapting those systems so they meet these requirements. We are neutral, ambivalent as to what the actual planning tool that farmers use. They can use whatever they want, and there are lots of planning tools out there, but they will need to be updated so that they meet the requirements of the freshwater farm plan system. Certifiers, we are in the right now we have got an RFP out there, a request for proposals, and we are working with people who might take on this role of verifying the qualifications and skills of the certifiers. That's a really important bit of work that's going on at the moment, and I think once we get that in place, then you'll start to see more proactive workforce development to build capacity and capability. What is clear, though, is that we are not going to have a full set of certifiers available when we want to kick this thing off early next year, so we're going to have some kind of interim recognition of your existing skills and capability, and then we'll have to build into a more formal recognition of skills over time. And that's it. The final thing I'd say is this thing is being tested all over the country. So parts of the system have been tested with 71 farmers and growers across the country, from one end to the other, all kinds of farming systems and all kinds of complexity of farming systems. We are now starting a process of piloting the system from end to end in a number of locations before we expect to roll out the full system starting. And it will be phased in over a number of years, actually. It won't all come to pass in the first year, but we'll be looking at probably Southland and maybe Gisborne, I think, for our initial stages of initial rollout. That's it, Dougal. Thanks.